Okay, Year 9. Hello and welcome to the first lesson that I've made for you as you begin your home learning and you begin to study the first of our GCSE texts, which is Shakespeare's Macbeth. So as you know that in this final teaching block of Year 9, you do an introduction to Macbeth. You will revisit Macbeth in Year 11 as you come towards preparing for your GCSEs. But in Year 9, we introduce Macbeth, and hopefully so you understand the story and the key characters and the main ideas in the play. So, before we start today's lesson, as with any lesson we are going to do a knowledge recall, you're going to need a piece of paper to write your answers down to these questions, okay? So, give yourself 5 minutes and you can pause the video and work through the questions. Obviously, question 1 is what is a tragic hero? Question 2, what is a tragic villain? What is the Greek word for a fatal flaw? What is pathos? And what is a cyclical structure? So some of these ideas you will have looked at when you studied Othello in Year 8, and other ideas we have looked at throughout all of the texts we've been studying in Year 9. So if you would like to pause the video there, write your answers down, and then once you've got your answers down, we'll turn on to the next slide. Okay, so hopefully you give yourself 5 minutes there. If you would like to get your green pen out as always, and as always, if you got the answer correct, give yourself a tick please, Year 9. But if you got it incorrect, please make sure you write in your green pen the correct answer. So of course, from our studies of Othello in Year 8, we know that a tragic hero is a respected and likeable and noble character, but a character also with a fatal flaw that leads to their downfall. Then we also know that a tragic villain is a dislikable character with seemingly evil intentions, who is often the catalyst for the tragic hero's downfall, so often plays some part in setting the tragic hero on a path of their demise and destruction. But the tragic villain will often pursue morally ambiguous logic, and by that the tragic villain may themselves not think they have evil intentions. They just their morals may be somewhat ambiguous and confused. Of course, we know that Greek word for a fatal flaw in tragedy is a hamartia. Pathos, of course, we've revisited this lots, even just in our last teaching block, Educating Rita, is where a text or language evokes a sense of pity or sympathy. And then, of course, a cyclical structure is where the beginning and end of a text or a piece of literature are directly linked. So if you can make sure that any you got incorrect, you pause the video and write the correct answers down for me in your green pen and give yourself a score out of 5. As always, you know you should be aiming for at least 4 out of 5 there, because that should be your 80% mark. Now, what will you need for this lesson? Now, this lesson is looking at the plot of Macbeth. Basically, the lesson is looking at what actually happens in Macbeth and how Macbeth is a tragedy. Now, what you're going to need for this lesson is a pen and a piece of paper, also ideally a ruler. You could benefit from some flashcards. These are not essential, but they may help, and there will be parts in the video where I suggest you make a flashcard. You are absolutely going to need your Macbeth knowledge organiser from your knowledge folder, and I suspect you're going to need about 45 minutes to go through this lesson. So let's make a start. So Macbeth is a tragedy. Now, what exactly is a tragedy? Now, a tragedy is a genre of play where a hero is brought down by his or her own flaws. Their demise and their downfall is inevitable, as they are unable to change the course of events on the basis that they are unable to control their fatal flaw. So basically, the premise of a tragedy is that the resolution will always be worse than the exposition for the tragic hero, and basically this tragic noble hero is always brought down by one of their own flaws. And their demise, their downfall, as I said, is inevitable. And the reason they cannot stop it is because they cannot control their fatal flaw. So let's look at Macbeth as a tragedy then. What makes Macbeth a tragedy, and who are these tragic characters within Macbeth? So, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the character of Macbeth is the tragic hero. So it is the character of Macbeth himself who is the tragic hero, and it is therefore his downfall which is explored throughout the play. Macbeth's hamartia, i.e. his fatal flaw, is over-ambition. He is too power-hungry. When he is promised kingship, he can't resist committing even the most heinous act to gain the power he is promised. He is so desperate for that power that he is being promised. He is willing to commit regicide and kill the king. He is willing to do anything, no matter how disgusting, no matter how deplorable. He is willing to do it because he is so overly ambitious. But that said, even though he commits these deplorable acts on this sense that he just wants power, we can feel a sense of pathos for Macbeth, as there are other factors which seem to incite him to act upon his fatal flaw. And there are aspects that seem to be the catalyst for him going off and heading on his downfall. Now, the witches give Macbeth prophecies, and the first round of prophecies mark the inciting action, the part of the story that sets the plot off, if you will. So when the witches give Macbeth the prophecies, they set him off on this trajectory, this downfall, this inevitable downfall that we know he is going to face. The witches in this inciting action tell him he will be Thane of Cawdor and ultimately King of Scotland. They tell his friend Banquo that his heirs will be kings too. And these promises of greatness, as we've said, are irresistible to Macbeth because he is so overly ambitious. And ultimately, as I've already said, they are the inciting action, the thing that sets him off on this path of destruction and on this path to his downfall. But more importantly as well, we've got the fact that his wife, Lady Macbeth, is the tragic villain. She is cunning and scheming. She plots to get him to commit the most heinous actions. She is a Machiavellian villain. You may have heard that word before. It comes from Machiavelli. And to be Machiavellian means to be cunning and scheming. And Lady Macbeth wants to gain power through her husband. This is the only way she can gain power in the patriarchal Jacobean society. And to do it, she emasculates him. She takes his masculinity from him. If you durst do it, then you are a man. She makes him feel like he has no choice. And Lady Macbeth is a very persuasive character. And she is really very persuasive in getting Macbeth, this tragic hero, to act on his over-ambition and to act on the fact that he wants to be king more than anything, and he wants this power more than anything, and ultimately getting him to commit the heinous act of regicide. Now, I've mentioned regicide a few times, but nice and simply, regicide just means to kill the king. Right, okay, so now we're going to look at the narrative arc. So in the exposition, Macbeth is a heroic and noble soldier. He is valiant and brave in the battle, and the king is so impressed with his work that he bestows the new title Thane of Cawdor upon him. But while Macbeth's heroic actions are being described and rewarded in the battle, the audience also learns of some witches in Act 1, Scene 1 who are on a heath, and they seem to be plotting something evil. And there is an instant foreshadowing that they are a malevolent force. And then we come to Act 1, Scene 3 and the inciting action. The witches give their first prophecies, and they promise Macbeth, they tell him that he will be Thane of Cawdor. And of course we already know that he will be. And that he will one day be king. Macbeth instantly becomes rapt with these witches, these promises of greatness. He even starts mirroring their language, saying, "So foul a fairer day have I not seen," when the witches had been talking about things being fair as foul and foul as fair. So instantly we see he's wrapped with them, perhaps even under a curse, under a spell by them. Now, but his friend Banquo, Macbeth's character foil, is also told that his heirs will be king one day. But Banquo doesn't respond in the same way. Banquo seems to realise instantly that these witches are instruments of darkness. He seems to see that they are a darker force, and Macbeth just doesn't seem to see it this way. Macbeth questions the goodness of the witches, but is so wrapped by their prophecies that he cannot seem to escape the idea and or his happiness at the promises they've given him. Now we move to the rising action. Now Lady Macbeth, remember our tragic villain, finds out that the witches have promised or made these prophecies of that her husband will be king. And she, of course, is too power hungry and power thirsty. And she wants her husband to have this power. She is in fact desperate to gain this power through her husband. And she seeks to emasculate him. So she manipulates him and makes him think that the only way he can prove he is a worthy man is indeed to kill the king. That is the only way he can be worthy and manly in her eyes. And of course, Lady Macbeth is extremely persuasive, and she does persuade her husband to kill Duncan. So Duncan comes over to their castle, and they are playing the honoured hostess. However, they are waiting till when Duncan sleeps, and when Duncan sleeps, Macbeth does kill the king. He commits regicide. Macbeth is instantly overwhelmed by guilt. He is unable to carry out the plan to its full. He does not leave the daggers by the guard's chamber, framing them for the murder. He instead brings the daggers back to Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, horrified, has to take control. And she takes the daggers back and frames the guard, but the guilt does not seem to be able to leave Macbeth. He questions if his hands will ever be clean of the blood. Now, of course, they need to commit murder, further murder, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, to cover up their tracks. The first thing Macbeth does is kills the guards. Why does he kill the guards? Well, because he's outraged. Macbeth wants to appear loyal and noble to the king, so Macbeth must also appear outraged at the heinous act or the heinous assumption that they have killed the king. Banquo is also killed. Macbeth realises that Banquo could knows of these prophecies and may suspect him. But more importantly, Macbeth also realises that he's need to kill Banquo's sons too. They were promised kingship also, so they could, in fact, make his throne vulnerable, because if these witches' prophecies are going to come true, then presumably one of Banquo's sons will be king one day. But one of Banquo's sons escapes. Macbeth is angry at the murderers, and Macbeth kills the murderers for what he deems as their incompetence. Now Duncan's sons, fearing for their life, flee. And Malcolm flees to England, and Donalbain, his other son, flees to Ireland. Okay, so now we're beginning to reach the climax, the point of greatest tension, and the point where things begin to change. So at the climactic turning point in Macbeth, it is the banquet scene. Now at this point, Macbeth is king. Macbeth arrives at his own banquet to find the table full. But of course, the table is not full for the king. But Macbeth is envisaging Banquo's bloody ghost, Banquo's ghost, Banquo who he has had murdered. He envisaged his bloody ghost sitting in his seat. And of course, there is foreshadowing there that Macbeth is beginning to descend into madness. Macbeth, panicked and fearful that his kingship is vulnerable, tries to return to the witches. And their witches give him a second set of prophecies. And he at this point feels invincible, because he has just been told that he cannot be harmed of anyone born of a woman. He has been told that he's safe until Birnam Wood marches towards him. Now, if he cannot be harmed of anyone born of a woman, and his kingship is safe until the woods march towards him, then he realises Trees can't walk, and we are all born of women. So he realises he has nothing to fear. But notably, he is told to beware Macduff. Now at this point, Lady Macbeth is not so confident anymore. Lady Macbeth is descending into madness. She cannot stop envisaging the metaphorical blood on her hand, which is symbolising guilt. She cannot get her hands clean. She is totally consumed by her guilt, and when sleepwalking, she falls from the battlements. Now we come to the resolution, and we know the resolution will be worse for our tragic hero than the exposition, because we know the entire play is interested in their downfall. Now in the resolution we see how the witches have deceived Macbeth, how they have tricked him with their half-truths. So the woods do walk towards Macbeth, but it is Macduff's army, as they are covered with the branches from the trees. And he did need to beware of Macduff, but he didn't need to beware of anyone born traditionally of a woman, as Macduff was born of caesarean section. And ultimately and importantly, Macbeth is killed for being a traitor. Just as Macbeth beheaded a traitor in Act 1, he is beheaded for being a traitor in Act 5. Okay, so Year 9, if you want to pause the video here, you may want to map out on your own drawing of Freytag's pyramid the key points in this plot summary. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes, pause the video, use your ruler to draw out Freytag's pyramid, and then go around and put the key points of the plot around the narrative arc in Act 1. Now, the narrative arc is cyclical, okay? In Act 1, Macbeth beheads a traitor, but by Act 5, Macbeth is beheaded for being a traitor. And that's really important because it's used by Shakespeare to show the inevitability of the tragic consequences you will face if you distort the natural order, if you go against the divine right of kings, if you commit treason or regicide, you will be punished. If you are a traitor, no matter how noble, no matter how respected, you will face the consequences. And that cyclical structure is used to show and emphasise that. Now, in your books, if you draw out the narrative, so if you draw out Freytag's pyramid here, and then along, you go back to the previous bit of the video, you pause it, and you put in very clearly the events which happen throughout the play. So you have a clear overview of the structure and the plot of that play. Now, finally, these are the things you may want to record on a flashcard, okay? It's not essential, you could just make notes, but these are the key points to take away from today's lesson. So the first key point is that Macbeth the play is a tragedy. It explores how a heroic and noble soldier's over-ambition leads to their downfall and demise. Macbeth is the tragic hero. His over-ambition means he cannot see logically. He cannot take the righteous path. His wife, Lady Macbeth, is cunning and scheming. She's a Machiavellian villain. She emasculates him as she schemes to gain power through him. She subverts gender stereotypes and expectations of women in the Jacobean era. And the supernatural are portrayed throughout the play as a malevolent force of evil, which corrupt Macbeth and distort the natural order. Okay, Year 9. So, hopefully that has given you an overview of the plot. You may want to go back to bits of the videos to make sure that your notes are comprehensive. I would very much recommend that you have a definition of what a tragedy is, that you have a summary of how Macbeth is the tragic hero and how Lady Macbeth is the tragic villain. That you also have the narrative arc drawn out on Freytag's pyramid, which is just that little triangle with the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action and resolution. And that you make at least a note of these 3 key points on this final slide, or that you put those on flashcards with questions on the front. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. I hope this has helped, and I will do a lesson tomorrow on the key ideas and wider messages in Macbeth, linking it to the context of the Jacobean era. Okay, thank you for watching. Speak to you later.